Happy New Year 2021. Let's talk about protocol level transaction fees, and I will use this as an opportunity to explain some things about transaction fees that people don't necessarily understand, and congestion in particular. This is a blog post that I wrote a little while back, and I encourage you to go and read that blog post on my blog site, which is ex.rs. But I wanted to give a high-level explanation in a video. Some folks prefer that. If you look at a cryptocurrency like Tezos, Bitcoin, or Ethereum, the way they're designed is that there is an optional field in every transaction where you can pay a transaction fee to the block producer or the miner who is going to include that transaction in their block. What's important to understand is that it's a completely optional field. You do not have to pay a transaction fee for your transaction to be included. There's nothing in a protocol that is going to directly require that. However, block space is scarce. There's a limit in how much transaction can be put in a block, because if you have no limit, you have some issues of centralization, some issues of processing power, so you're going to have some limit. So there's a scarce amount of block space that's available, and you need to convince whoever is going to make the block that they should include your transaction and not someone else's transaction. And the way this works is by paying them. All of these protocols, they give you a very convenient way of paying the block producer through a transaction fee. But you don't have to use this way. You could go directly to the block producer and pay them and say, look, I'm going to be sending you a lot of transactions and I will pay you for that. You don't even have to inject that transaction on a peer-to-peer network. That's just something that's convenient. And there's a tendency to think that because everyone uses a convenient feature of paying your fees as part of the transaction, then somehow that makes it part of the protocol. But it's not, and we're going to see why that matters. So it's well known that when there's a lot of demand, everyone wants to make a transaction, and there's only so much block space, so transaction fees can shoot and become very, very high. And I would say it's almost common wisdom that the problem is the lack of elasticity. What is elasticity? It's the ability of some commodity to respond, to have its supply respond to demand. So if tomorrow the demand for oil increases, well, the price of oil is going to increase, but also the extraction of oil is going to increase. If the demand for a car increases, then the price of cars might go up, but the production capacity of cars might go up. And you might think that, oh, well, all we need to do is when there's a higher demand for block space, all we need to do is just have slightly higher blocks. But the difference is that when you have a given capacity for producing cars, the reason your capacity is not larger is because producing more cars might be more expensive. You know, the next available factory that you can buy to build your car might be a little more expensive. The next person that you might hire to help you build your car might require a slightly higher salary. So it's a cost question. The capacity for producing a car is set by the marginal price of a car. And so if the demand increases and the price increases, you have more capacity. The capacity that you have in blocks is not set by cost. If tomorrow the people who validate transaction start receiving more transaction fees, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can have a higher block size, because it's a parameter which is set based on security, not cost. You know, if it could be the case that the downside of having larger block could be offset by block producers receiving higher transaction fees, you could have some elasticity, but that's not really what's going on here. There's a sort of natural limit to the supply of a block space that you can have. It's a technological limit. It's not really an economic limit. And that's why if you're going to have any elasticity, there's not a whole lot to be gained here. There's also a second phenomenon, which is that sometimes people will mistake demand for high fees for something which has been called miner extractable value. I would call it block producer extractable value. And that happens on smart contract platforms. So let's say you have some sort of text or some sort of game, and there's something to be won. And sometimes you're in a position where whoever inserts the first transaction in the block is going to win some prize. Maybe they notice an arbitrage between two dexes. Maybe there's a game that's about to expire, but or an auction. There's some reason that makes it very valuable to be the first transaction in a block. And what ought to happen in this scenario is that Well, the block producer should be able to take advantage of that. But block producers are not really set up to take these opportunities into account. What they do mostly is to just produce blocks. They're not actively trying to find these. And so other people are doing so. And in order to be included in the blocks first, they start paying very, very large fees because everyone is trying to get that opportunity. And so the very large fee here is not really does not really represent congestion in a sense that there's not really a demand for making that many transactions because they're all the same transaction trying to get the same thing. It's just that there's an economic equilibrium where the transaction fee you're going to pay is going to be equal to the value of whatever opportunity you're trying to grab. And so that can generate very, very high fees because the block producers are not properly set up for taking into account those opportunities. What's important to note here is that Elasticity does nothing for you. If there's a smart contract and the first transaction in the next block is going to get $10,000 worth of cryptocurrency or what have you, it doesn't matter how many transactions you can have in your block. People will increase their fees and outcompete each other all the way to $10,000. And so a lot of what you see in the fees in smart contract platform is this a minor extractable value and is not something that responds to elasticity. Okay, why am I talking about all this? Well, there's an idea that's been floating in the Ethereum community called EIP 1559, where basically they're trying to move the fees and make it a part of the protocol. Instead of just making it a convenient aspect of the protocol, you say, no, we're going to like hard code it in the protocol that you have to pay your fees. Now the problem is how do we know how many fees should be paid? The way they do it is they give some elasticity of the block. Not a lot. I think the block can be about there's a target average space for the block, and at most you can have twice that space. But what they'll do is they'll require everyone to burn tokens instead of spending them, and that's important because if you're paying something to a miner, something you can fake because maybe you're the miner, maybe the miner pays you back, it's not a reliable signal. Burning is a reliable signal. So they burn the tokens, but how many? Well, they leave the block producers free to include how many transactions they want within some limits. But if the block starts being higher than the average, then the burn increases. And so, even if the miner in theory could include all of these transactions, there are not going to be that many transactions willing to pay a higher burn fee. And so if the block starts being too small in the sense that there's very few transactions in them, very little burn, then the size goes down. So you have this retroaction mechanism where the size of the block is controls the amount of burn, and the amount of burn determines the size of the blocks. So you have a system that moves in lockstep. Now you still have a very small transaction fee that is being paid to the block producer, but it's very small because it just has to be epsilon over the baseline. The baseline is everyone assumes, okay, it's going to cost me that much per gas unit to include that transaction. We all know this. So instead of paying that to the miner, it just gets burned and you just pay like a small difference. Now that small difference could be very large if you're talking about an arbitrage. If you're talking about capturing an opportunity on chain, that won't help you, right? You're still going to have very high fees, very, very high congestion, but it can help you with just like natural demand for transaction. I don't see the elasticity doing a whole lot more because I think that just moving your block size by a factor of 2 doesn't really alleviate this. So I don't think it's a solution for congestion. What is a solution for congestion in my mind is more of an economic solution, because the main problem with congestion is that people have a need to make transactions. If you have a business that relies on a public blockchain, if you have a state channel that you need to have the ability to close quickly in case the other party tries to close a channel in a bad state, if you are on a commit chain, sometimes you just need to have reliable access to the chain at a reliable price. And if somehow someone just launched some virtual cats at the same time, you don't want to be you don't want to not be able to include your transaction or to have to pay a very large fee just because it ends up being right in the middle of a big fad. So people think that this is mostly a technological problem. that what you should do is say, well, we need to have space for everyone's transaction and just scale infinitely. And if we do that, then we won't have this problem. And certainly, the ability to scale is a great thing, but I think it's looking a little bit at the problem wrong. If you have a need for a long-term need for block space, what you need is a long-term service agreement. You see, the problem is thinking that the only ways to pay fees is to pay them directly to the block producers. And that doesn't need to be the case. You can have a contract with a block producer that says, look, I need to include that many transactions per month. And I would like a guarantee that I'm going to be able to do that, and I will pay you a fixed rate to do this. And so most of the time, you're going to get to pay the average fee, and the miner will receive the average fee, and they'll be happy. And sometimes there'll be a lot of congestion. And even though the miner might think, well, I really wish I could include those very, very large fee-paying transactions, they have a contract with you. And because of that contract, they have to include your transaction. You see the exact same dynamic in the energy market, by the way. If you look at the spot price of electricity, it's extremely volatile. If everyone starts turning on their AC at the same time, the price of electricity is going to spike. And in the short term, on the grid, there's just not a whole lot of elasticity. You can get power plants started, you can increase the quantity, but you're limited. The shocks to the demand are much stronger than the ability of the supply to respond. But what do people do in the electricity market? They enter into long-term service agreements. There is no reason why people should not enter into long-term service agreements with block producers. Here's another aspect. People make a big deal of this idea of miner extractable value. They're thinking, hey, if I send some trade to a chain and try to do some sort of decentralized exchange, what if someone sees my transaction in the mempool and copies it, and then they try to include it by paying a higher fee or by bribing the miner? And again, it's thinking of this completely wrong, and they're moving in a direction where they're saying, well, maybe we should force the miners to be neutral with respect to transactions and so on and so forth. It's been called front running, which is a complete misnomer for what this is. Essentially, if you want to have a fiduciary relationship with whoever includes your transactions, you can totally do that. Just don't use the peer-to-peer network. You don't have to send your transaction in a dark forest. You can go to a producer and say, look, I am sending you my transaction and we're going to have a contract, and you're not allowed to look at my transaction, and you're not allowed to copy them. And if you do, I'll know, because it's a public block. It's a problem that can be solved contractually very easily, and people are completely missing this. Because it's a lot cooler to think of technological solutions. But I worry that there's a bad trend here where people think that, the block producers should somehow do things a certain way, as opposed to giving a lot of flexibility into the type of relationships that people who want to include transactions and people who do include transaction interact with each other. Now, long-term service agreements, they don't solve the scalability problem. If you have a ton of people who want to use your blockchain at the same, all the time, then sure, you need more capacity. There's no question about that. But it solves the spike problem. It solves the problem of saying, sometimes I need to do a transaction, and if at that time there happens to be a traffic jam on a chain, I don't want to be affected. There's another aspect of this EIP 1559 that people have discussed, and they say, it's great because economically it creates some economic tie between the token and the transaction activity. And that is true, but that is only true for proof of work network. For proof of stake network, it does nothing that doesn't already exist on a proof of stake network. Let me explain. On a proof of stake network, if people are paying very large transaction fees, then it means that it's very valuable to produce blocks, because you collect all of these transaction fees. And that's true regardless of how they're paid. Right? If people are willing to pay a lot to include their transactions, it doesn't matter if they pay the block producers on chain, it doesn't matter if they pay them wire payment, it doesn't matter if they pay them using state channels or what have you. At the end of the day, it's valuable to produce a block. And how do you get to produce blocks? Well, you get that by having block producing rights, baking rights in Tezos, and you get that by holding the token. So the link between the token and the transactions is already present in a proof of stake network, regardless of how they're paid. In a proof of work network, that's not what happens. In a proof of work networks, if your transaction fee rise, what you get is you get more hashing power in your chain, like the hash power security of your chain increases. And in theory, if you have both a subsidy and and transaction fees, you could say, well, if I have these very high transaction fees, I can decrease my subsidy because I know that my hash power is being paid by the transaction fees anyways. And Bitcoin tries to do it on a fixed schedule where they gradually get rid of the blocks subsidy and say, well, we'll rely on transaction fees only, even though we don't really know if transaction fees are going to be sufficient to secure the chain. That's a real question. It's quite possible that they will, but there's a lot of good reasons why they might not, especially if you're using other systems to transact outside of the main chain. And in fact, if you are, I think like if you are a proof of work chain like Ethereum or like Bitcoin, something like EIP 1515 makes a lot of sense. In fact, if you are, I think the chain for which it makes the most sense would be Bitcoin. Never going to happen. Never going to happen. First of all, massive not invented here symptom. Second of all, it's just like innovation is just not what they do. But rather than say, hey, we're not going to have a block reward. We're just going to rely on transaction fees and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. You could say, well, let's have a subsidy and let's burn the transaction fees. And if it so happens that we're right and that the transaction fees are sufficient as a subsidy, then it will still be deflationary, and that's great. And if we happen to be wrong, then we'll still be secure. So in some sense, you'll get the both of both words. This is the whole thing. The whole space is driven by narrative. It's not driven by solid arguments. So it's just not going to happen. But if you want to like travel back in time in 10 years, it would not be a bad design idea, to be honest. All right. So proof of stake chain. Is it still worth it if you have proof of stake to try to do something like this EIP? Well, there's two. So in the two claim benefits, one is elasticity, and I don't think the benefits of elasticity are very large because the block space doesn't change that much. So I'm not going to really look at this one and as like a big factor. It is nice to burn instead of just having this kind of like more roundabout way of saying, well, it will accrue to the token holder one way or another because it accrues to the block producers. Because that can be a little murkier. The economic argument is pretty solid, but it's easier if you burn it. The other benefit is that if you know inside your protocol, for sure, what is the fee? Because you don't know that if the fee is optional, right? If inside of the inside of the Tezos protocol, we could measure how much transaction fees are going to be paid, but it's not a reliable number. Because, if someone has an interest in making that number higher than it really is, they could create blocks and include transactions with very large fees to themselves. So you can't really trust that. And if someone had an incentive to make that number appear lower than it is, well, they could pay off-band for transaction inclusion. So you can't really rely on this number. If you start having a burn-like system, then now the number becomes reliable and you can do other things. There's interesting economic ideas that you can do. You can say, hey, this contract has more activity, and you know that for sure because people are actually burning more transaction fees to access it. So it's not something you can easily fake. So it lets you build cool things in your protocol. But the main downside of it is that you lose the ability to make these long-term service agreements. And that, I think, is a problem. So if you have a big transaction spike, if you have all of a sudden a lot of demand, then the burn size increases for everyone. And now I can't enter into an agreement with a block producer and ask them to include my transactions because I'm the one on the hook for paying the burn. Not only do they need to include my transaction, I need to be able to put the burn, and I don't know in advance how much it's going to cost me. And so that's something that we lose. You can kind of regain it, but now you need essentially three parties to this agreement. First, you need to agree with the transaction producer, with the block producer, that they are going to include your transaction. And then you need to somehow have some sort of financial instrument that's going to hedge the cost of the burn. Some sort of future by saying I want to hold an instrument that's going to cost me exactly the value, that's going to be worth exactly the value of one burn 1 month from now. So you add some complexity to the system, and I think it's a little unfortunate. You gain in some UX, it's a little easier. You don't have to kind of predict the fees. You can just look at what the burn is, and it's a reliable number. So it's better. It's a little better UX, but you lose something which is quite important. Maybe something to consider would be to just do a half and half. You know, half of the block has a burn, and half of the block is just a fee market like the other one, and see what happens. I think this kind of middle of the road solutions are where you get both are generally underrated. One last aspect is that this long-term service agreement, it works a lot better in proof of stake than proof of work for two reasons. One is that not in all proof of stake algorithms, but in many proof of stake algorithms, you know in advance who's going to create a block. And so you can directly go to them. You say, no, that block is going to be produced by you. I know you're producing it. So I can go to you and pay you directly. I don't have to go through the mempool. I don't have to do any of this. But the more important aspect also is that difficulty can change in a proof of work network. And so even though even if I have a big mining operation, even if I have a lot of ASICs, I don't know how many blocks I'm going to be able to produce next month. You have a much better idea if in a proof of stake network. In a proof of stake network, if you own stake, you own a fraction of the block capacity that can be produced, and so you have some pretty good idea of how many transactions you're going to be able to include in the future. And so maybe that's why long-term service agreements have not really panned out in older proof of work chain like Ethereum and Bitcoin, but certainly I think that in proof of stake chain they could become a big thing. Anyways, if you want to read more about this, I recommend the blog post is on my blog ex.rs. And in the meantime, I think the YouTube terms of service ask me to require you to like the video, subscribe, be notified, basically interact with it in all the possible ways that will increase engagement for this video. Thank you very much, and until next time.